Welcome, everyone, to the first and perhaps only Spirituality and Social Justice Symposium. And I just want to say a couple of words. Why are we doing this? The Second Inclusion Network has been doing these events for about 3 years, and we have a number of people on our mailing list. And I found that essentially people belong to one of two camps, or maybe one of three camps. Either they're very involved in social activism, or they're very involved, I guess is the right word, for spirituality. And it's only a kind of a slice of people that are in the middle. I thought it'd be very interesting to invite some people that have a lot more experience in these areas than I do, and I'm about to introduce them. And I'm going to do that in terms of what's showing up on my screen here. So I've got Lucas Johnson. He's on my left. Lucas is the executive director of the On Beings Project Civil Conversations and Social Healings team. And he's also been a leader of community in the International Fellowship of Reconciliation, which is the world's largest or oldest interfaith organization. And he's been shaped by his time learning from veterans of the civil rights movement, most notably Vincent Harding and Dorothy Cotton. And next on my screen, I have the newly ordained Rabbi Kat Zavis. I don't know if she's that newly now at this point. Kat is the executive director of the Network of Spiritual Progressives. She's a longtime activist, and she's done things like volunteer for the American Civil Liberties Union and prisoners' rights organizations, domestic violence victims, and the Lawyers Committee for Human Rights. She's worked as a public defender and then as a women's rights lawyer. She also has some experience in Palestine, which maybe we'll talk about. Last but not least, I have Shariff Abdullah, who's a longtime activist who in the early 1960s helped found the Black People's Unity movement in his, at that time, native Camden. And he later became an attorney and received national awards for innovative self-help and community empowerment activities. He later became dissatisfied with the adversarial process as a means of social change and founded the Commonway organization and widened his focus from attempting to change society via community and economic development programs to transforming society by shifting consciousness and creating sustainable, inclusive, empowered, and value-driven individuals and organizations. So you'll notice that I put you on mute because I wanted to, at least the people to have, our panels to have an option to say something. Let me tell you about the agenda. In the first 45 minutes, we're going to have a panel discussion around certain questions, and then I'm going to put you in breakout rooms. And if you look, I don't know, some of you may be on your phones, but in a lot of the breakout rooms, you have options. We're going to put you in them at the time that we do that in about 45 minutes. But you're going to be able to assign your own breakout rooms. And if you have difficulty, just put that in the chat, and Ian or myself will put you in the proper room. And that's it. The other thing is that we want to allow for some questions. So in the middle of this, or at the end of this, or whatever you want, you can simply put your questions in the chat. And if it's directed to someone, just note that. And yeah, and then then we'll be able to make you in there. And then at some point, if you do ask questions, I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself, or you unmute yourself, just raise your hand. So those are all the housekeeping things I could think of. And so let's get started. So panel, I want people to know a little bit more about you than your bio. And I know that all of you have been involved at various times in what I call social activism progress. You've been involved in activism. I wonder if you could tell people just a little bit about maybe one of the more successful, or at least interesting, projects that you've been involved in, and maybe about a little bit about the outcome. And then we'll go on from there. And anybody can start. I could call on somebody, but I don't like doing that. Like I'm going to have to call on somebody. All right, Lucas, you're first.
I was just gonna say, I don't know how I ended up being arranged in this order. Um, yeah. Well, thank you, Angela. Thank you for the invitation to be here. It's good to see all of you in the room, and I'm glad to be here, and I'm glad to be on this panel with these two wise folks. I'm trying to think about a campaign or a thing that I might reference that was particularly successful. Um,
It
I
can't just be interesting. It doesn't have to be successful.
okay. I mean, a lot of my uh a lot of my work, I mean, first of all, I don't do many things alone. So whatever successes or sometimes failures, it was something that we always did in sort of community. I think maybe one of the things that I'm proudest of in our efforts was sort of the work I did for the International Fellowship of Reconciliation, trying to make sure that the stories of nonviolent activists around the world were represented at the Human Rights Council and Human Rights Committee in Geneva, and defending the right to conscientious objection to military service. And the particular conscientious objectors in their desire to object to war and militarism and violence. And so I don't know if that's the kind of specificity that you're looking for. I think you may be thinking of more like grassroots campaigns, and I'm still warming up here, so I'm gonna save that, leave that here, leave that on the table, and maybe we'll come back to something else. But I'll just offer that as a example of work that I've done that was interesting and that I was particularly proud of.
How about you, Kat?
Hi, everyone. It's lovely to be here. Thanks for joining us. I recognize some faces. It's lovely to see you. And what an honor to be on this panel with all of you. So thank you for having me. I was struggling with this question too, Lucas. So I'm going to choose, because there's different levels of ways in which I've participated in social change, but I think I'm going to choose when I was working as a women's rights lawyer in Washington State, and we were representing women prisoners in Alaska. And the interesting thing about being a women prisoner in Alaska is that given the size of the state and the number of women prisoners, or those awaiting trial, so those in jail, were often in isolated situations where they were all alone and they could not basically leave the cell. In some instances, they were literally in a cell like 23 hours a day because they were in a men's prison and they were the only woman there. So we sued the state of Alaska and we won, and it completely transformed these women's lives. And in one example, they were in a medium security prison, and their freedom of movement was controlled and limited by the men's needs and the men's schedules. And at the end of the lawsuit, that the women actually ended up getting the whole prison, and they had a much more liberated, free experience than they had previously. Granted, in the context of prison life, and as an abolitionist, that's not my highest goal, but it is a path and a step along the way.
Shariff, you have to unmute to answer a question.
Hello, everybody. I've got a cold, so hope not to infect you. Zoom is getting really good nowadays. My problem is I had too many things to decide from, so I decided to pick one international and one domestic. In terms of the international, I guess the biggest thing and the most successful thing unfortunately not long lasting, was the peace activities, the Sarvodaya Peace Action Plan in Sri Lanka. Over the course of 5 years, partnering with Sarvodaya in Sri Lanka and my organization, Commonway, here in the States, we were able to stop a shooting war. And we stopped the war without involving the so-called leaders. We know that people don't want war, but we'll end up talking to the leaders, and the leaders always want war because that's how they get power. So we kind of cut the leaders out of the picture and went straight for people who did not want the war. And it was touch and go, and lots of people disagreed with the idea of cutting out the leaders, but it works, and it's something I recommend. In terms of the domestic work, I work in Camden, New Jersey when I was still a teenager. Yes, at one point in time I was a teenager. With the Black People's Unity Movement was a real example of success and failure intermixed in the same issue. For example, we had achieved real empowerment. We owned a number of businesses. We had 2 daycare centers, 100 units of housing, a supermarket, a gas station. I mean, we were trying to build a little mini city inside of Camden. So we were really successful on the one hand. On the other hand, most of us were alcoholic, drug addicted. Most of us had burning, seething anger inside. And you couldn't get to it because you were too busy blaming somebody else for your anger. So it was, on the one hand, success and holding on to the seeds of our failure. And all of that stuff got me to the point where I'm really focusing in on the consciousness aspects of how do we achieve a new way of looking at and living on the planet.
Well, that's sort of a good segue to my next question. As you all know, the theme of our symposium here is the intersection of spirituality and social justice. And I hope to not have to call on you sequentially, panel. So I guess my broad question is, so you're still involved in various things. How does your spiritual or religious, I'm not going to get into the distinction between those two things, how does that inform the kind of the work that you're doing when you engage in sort of like grassroots activism, or maybe not grassroots activism, but activism?
Well, since my
Thank you.
My mic is unmuted already, I'll go ahead and jump in, and I'll wait to see Lucas or Kat to unmute themselves, or I can just keep talking. It's interesting. I think that my spirituality permeates all of my actions personally, my actions in the world, etc. So the reason I act in the world is because of my spirituality. It's not like it's a tack on the one hand. On the other hand, it means I have to have a very personal spirituality, because in most religious organizations, this concept that drives my life, the concept of inclusivity, you don't find it there. Most religions define themselves as, I'm different from those people over there. What we're trying to do is look for what keeps us the same. Look for what keeps us connected. And And how does that drive my activity in the world? How can I do that activity? How can I bring peace, compassion, etc. to the world and stay connected with people that we are very used to separating from? People from a different religion, people from a different ethnic group, people from a different political persuasion. How can I stay connected? And that's my driving element. Lucas?
Yeah, first I was going to say, please don't wait for me to go. Don't just, I will be on mute from time to time just because of background noise. So don't always rely on that as a cue for whether or not I'm going to say something. But I agree with you, Shariff, in terms of the, my spirituality being a sort of undergirding, source of inspiration and a resource for me in terms of my continued work for peace and for healing and for justice in our world. I think that it also shapes my kind of disposition to the questions that we're confronting, I think, in our time. It orients my sense of time. It orients my understanding of like the pace of work, and it helps me. It's a source of resilience for me, I think, and so I believe that like most of the things that we have to confront. Certainly, my relationship to nonviolence, but even without that, I think that most of the challenges that we have to confront require kind of inner resources. And, those inner resources might be defined in spiritual terms and language. And I'm rather agnostic about that. I don't care so much about the language one uses to describe inner life, other than that language is useful for them. But I do believe that it takes work on inner life in order to prepare us to do the outward work in the world well, in order for us to show up as the people we intend to be. And I think that when we neglect that inner work, it ends up kind of poisoning the outer. And so to me, that's maybe a description of my approach and my understanding of the work to be done. I think we have a tendency to focus on systems and structures and neglect the kind of human condition that's at the center of these systems and structures, and the work we have to do on ourselves and in relationship to each other. And that, again, that also stems from my sense of our interconnectedness and how we exist. And I think all these kind of stem from my spiritual formation. So
I'll jump in. So the challenge of going last, as everyone said so much rich stuff. So I echo a lot of what's been said, and I will say that my spiritual religious tradition also has a message that is very deep and rich in my heart, which is that the Exodus, the story. So I'm a Jewish rabbi, and the story in the Exodus is that Moses didn't only come to free the slaves. Moses came to change the consciousness that which is that which has to be. Moses came to tell the slaves that we can actually transform the world, not just that we can get better conditions in our work environment, but that fundamentally the world can and should be transformed, and that there's a force in the universe. I like to think of it as love. Some people call it God or Yahweh, or we have lots of different names, but there's this force in the universe that compels us. It lives within each of us, and it's beyond any of us, compels us to participate in building a more loving and just world. And that for me is, yes, we all need to work on our individual selves. But when the Hebrews were told to kill the lamb and place its blood on the mantle of the doorpost, so that's what we get a mezuzah from, they had to do that as individuals. So there had to be some level of individual willingness to take a risk and have courage and act as individuals, but they did it in community. They did it collectively. So it was a simultaneous individual and collective consciousness transformation. And for me, yes, all of my social justice work is deeply steeped in a deep spiritual consciousness and groundedness, and in my prayers and my meditation and my various practices, and they help me. But each of us, all of us here today, are perfectly imperfect. We're all wounded healers. And there's nobody on the planet who isn't. And so as we work to transform ourselves, we have to simultaneously work to change the society and the systems and structures of society, because none of us can attain the level of healing and transformation and wholeness that we seek as individuals as long as we live in a morally bankrupt world.
I have a list of questions, but I see, okay, go ahead, Shariff.
Yeah. Both Lucas and Kat have raised some really, really interesting, really good points. Lucas was talking about nonviolence, and the activism that I was doing when I was still in Camden was still informed by the very violent past that I grew up with in Camden. Violence was like part of the fabric of the society that we were in. I was watching a video clip the other day, just yesterday, on they're interviewing some prisoners in the Bay Area, and they were talking about, excuse me, they were talking about their violence, the violence that got them in prison was just an average, just the background of the society they were living in. It's like living near a freeway. After a while, you don't hear it anymore, And I had to consciously, actively stop that. And I took a vow of nonviolence in the 80s. And that was very, very hard, because there's a whole bunch of folks that I had promised to kill, and I was like, well, shoot, didn't get around to it. Kat was talking about how her tradition feeds her spirituality to act in the world as a moral human being. There are people who use exact same religious language to do exactly the opposite, which is one of the reasons why I've unsprung myself from all religious traditions. I had a moment of unspringing. I started out as a Christian, flirted with Buddhism, wound up 15 years as a practicing Muslim, 5 prayers a day, and a little spot on my forehead. And I was praying. I was starting prayer with a group of Muslims, and the guy directly in front of me, as we were lined up, had on a T-shirt. And on the back of the T-shirt, it said, "Kill them all and let God sort it out." And as I sat there reading this, I realized I shouldn't be in the same room with this guy, let alone praying. I don't know what he's praying to. I don't know who he's praying to. It's definitely not what I'm praying to. even if he meant it as a joke, that is not a funny joke. And so my when a group recognizes its spirituality, I support that and I applaud that. And you can find those groups in Judaism, you can find those groups in Christianity, you can find those groups in Islam, Hinduism, they're all over. And when they deviate from it, it's like, okay, well, you're over there doing your thing with the group of people who doesn't believe in inclusivity and doesn't believe in the sanctity of life and doesn't believe, it's like, okay, that's your religion over there. And I can keep going, but I'm not.
Angela, you muted.
Yeah,
You're muted.
there's a question in the chat, and I think it was from Rainer about leadership in the next generation. Was that you, Rainer?
I don't think I typed anything in the chat, but I could be wrong.
No, somebody did about leadership in the next generation, and I'll try to represent it. And whoever, because I just have initials, so I don't know who did it unless somebody's going to raise their hand.
That was me.
Okay, so please, Ruth Ann.
Ann. Yeah,
Yes.
Ruth Ann.
Yes, why don't you just ask your question?
Oh, well, I was listening to something you said earlier about this concept of going around the leadership. And I want to be honoring, I want to be respectful of those who've, you know, quote unquote, held down the fort or kept our communities together. But sometimes it's time to go around the leadership. And so I wondered, like, what Sharif's experience was in doing that, or how we might learn how to do that respectfully and creatively. Thank you.
Both respectfully and creatively. And a lot of the things that we did, we added a whole level of fun. Yeah, a lot of times, what we call social movements is kind of gloom and doom, et cetera. It's like, yeah, let's have some fun with this. In Sri Lanka, and for those who don't know where Sri Lanka is, it's the teardrop-shaped island off the tip of India, which is about as far from Camden, New Jersey as you can get. And a whole different set of dynamics, but all of them really the same. Yeah, the people at the very, very top, who are the ones who want war. They want the war to exist. They believe they derive their power from war. Then you have all the people underneath them who fight the war. What happens when you organize the people who are underneath them? Well, we know what happens now. What happens is that the war stops. You give people a different thing to fight for, like fighting for our community nonviolently. And we did that at the level of changing consciousness. So our principal tool were the peace meditations, where you sit down and you literally meditate for peace in the area. And then you leave them with, what are you going to do when you go back home? We did a couple of things which really honors the local leadership, not these folks at the top that make millions and millions of dollars from the existence of the war. But yeah, local village level leaders, of having village level programs that increase the local leaders' power. One of them that's right off the top of my head is something that we did called village to village, heart to heart. We literally pick up a Sinhalese village, put them on buses and take them to a Tamil village. And they would then work in the Tamil village to do road improvements, build a school, things like that. So they can actually see that these are real human beings. Then we would pick up the Tamil village and take them to the Sinhalese village, and they would spend the day building roads, et cetera, et cetera. and they would actually see them not as the enemy, but they would see them as just another human being like me. Okay. And a lot of other things too. I mean, there's just a lot of work we did that was all of it aimed towards stopping the war. When the war stopped, we were actually surprised that it happened. So we had more weapons in our nonviolent weapons in our armory there, and we never got to try them. One of the nonviolent weapons was, at one point in time, we were going to ask the women who came to the peace meditation to write a letter and tell their sons to come home. Just, your mother is calling you. Now, these guys revere their mothers. Their mothers are close to gods, okay? And what would that do? I wanted to find out. I never got a chance to find out. So there's lots of things you can do in the context of first saying it'll be nonviolent. It will bring us together. It will not make any enemies, and hopefully it'll be fun too.
You know, I want to pick up on this question of leadership. Maybe I'm rephrasing it a little bit from what it was saying, but you know, we have a similar situation here. I don't know why it keeps focusing on person, where you know, the leaders seem to be insane or insensitive. So, I mean, the question is, what can we do to underride that, or to you know, to present an alternative, so that we don't have to be kind of like bogged down in old them versus us leadership thinking. So yeah, so I'm just throwing it out there.
So I think one of the things that we really are struggling with in our society today, that we're seeing bubbling over, is this unwillingness and inability to talk across differences and to hold the possibility that somebody who has a different view than us is a human being deserving of dignity and respect, that maybe their worldview is shaped and informed by many experiences in their lives, and that maybe if we opened ourselves to hearing that, we might have a deeper understanding. It's kind of like what Shariff was saying, of bringing different people into different people's communities to really understand each other. The thing about leadership is that it's controlled in our country, for sure, and in many places, by powers beyond the leaders. They're not there really to serve the people. They're there to serve the economic interests of the ruling class. And so I don't think that the leaders are our answers. They're leading us astray. They're leading us into incredible hatred and separation from each other, instead of helping us to see that we're all created in the image of a divine source of life and love, and that all of us, the vast majority of us, actually want, as Shariff said, to live in a world that's kind and generous and loving. So what we need to do is we need to build movements that, rather than putting other people down for not being woke enough, or for being too elite, or for all the different ways in which we attack each other, we need to start stepping into a space where we can hold the possibility that actually we all are harmed and damaged by the ethos of domination and power over, that manifests in many ways. It's manifesting in crony capitalism, it's manifesting in patriarchy, it's manifesting in imperialism and nationalism. It's manifesting in all these systems and structures that we're experiencing and that are acting upon us, and shaping our consciousness to believe that the only way we can live is by dominating others. And if you listen to the leaders, you will hear them speaking in that discourse over and over and over again, instead of speaking in a discourse of love and kindness and generosity. Let's become curious. Let's talk to them and hear their perspective. Let's bring them into a room where we could collectively explore what we're seeking together. And I don't think that our leaders, because they serve the bottom line of the capitalist class, of money and power, really are interested in reaching those solutions. As Shariff said, they went outside of them. So I think that we have to build movements that not only seek a change in laws and systems like $15 minimum wage, but that actually seek to change consciousness, that actually help us move from the consciousness of domination and power over, including those of us who think we're better than the others, to a consciousness of love and compassion and generosity and care and curiosity and empathy.
Hey, Angelo, before we go, I saw that Yitzhak/Jerry had a question.
Yeah, I saw that. I was going to, before we get to that, want to see if Lucas had anything he wanted to add.
I'm sympathetic to what Kat and Sharif just said. I mean, I think there's some things, some ways that I'd want to nuance it. I'd want to speak with greater specificity when we're talking about sort of our leaders or the leaders. I mean, I think there's, societies are complex, and you have different ways of analyzing and talking about leadership. And the reason why that matters to me is only because I think we've fostered a culture where certainly people in leadership aren't encouraged. None of us are encouraged to be vulnerable in public. None of us are encouraged to, we don't have a society that allows us to change our minds in public or grow or really develop as full human beings. And that has been true for a long time. That's true in, I think one of the ways that, one of my principal mentors used to talk about Malcolm X was just how the extent to which people who loved him wouldn't allow him to change and grow, right? And so there's ways in which we have a tendency to place expectations and create conditions in our society that don't allow for growth and development of people in leadership and people in positions of power. And so as much as I'm sympathetic to, people who are being influenced by, malevolent, actors, and as much as I'm, concerned about money and politics and all these other things, and I feel like there's a dimension that needs to be named that's much more insidious and much more difficult sometimes, and that is just the kind of way that we have a tendency to create conditions that are actually hard for the leadership that we want. And I think that requires some introspection for us as a society to talk about what we're doing and how we've done this. I think the other thing that I'd say is that the other way that I would kind of nuance some of these things is that I think both from peace building perspectives and from in terms of the analysis, I don't know much about Sri Lanka, and Sharif, I'm not in any way meaning to contradict what you're offering. I think you would probably also agree to this, and just that it takes multi-layered approaches, and just as much as you have folks happening, just as much as you're sort of creating conditions for the kind of people-to-people diplomacy that you're describing, and for some of the kind of grassroots movement and civil society actors to be able to engage, I think you also want to think about who are the people in leadership that you could pull into private conversation that might also help or prepare them for the change that might come, right? So I think that there's lots of different approaches that can be made, and so I just want to nuance, add a little bit of nuance to what's been said, but I'm largely sympathetic to it.
So I'm about to put you in breakout rooms, but if anyone has a question, this is the time to do it, and we're going to have time, a little bit of time later. But if there's someone has a question, please raise your hand or unmute yourself and ask what you have to ask.
I'd like to, this is Jerry Green. I'm a retired California lawyer, living in Oregon now. And I used to defend holistic practitioners when they were charged with practicing medicine without a license in Northern California, pioneered role clarification in healthcare around decision making. But I want to return to this question of who's the leaders, because I think what Sharif was encouraging us to think about was really crucial for where this conversation goes. And I think it's an aside to the basic question is, where is the nexus between our spirituality and our political activism? But the first question that I think we were struggling with was, who are the leaders in that thinking? And I want to support the idea that the leaders are not the designated leaders, but the people. That's what he was saying. And I want to support it with the experience of having conducted a series of Jewish-Palestinian dialogues in Sonoma County when I was living there, and being approached by a gaggle of Russian women after one of the events saying, you know, the Cold War was not ended by the leaders of the countries. The Cold War was ended by a cultural exchange that was brought about by citizens. And they were among the citizens who did that. The Cold War, they were saying, was not ended by the leaders. At the end, they played a role in ending it. But I want to say that not only are not the designated leaders not the leaders, but that the issues that Sharif called attention to when anger came in between people who were trying to reach one another. And he said, we can't overlook the human condition, the healing, the fixing, the tikkun that has to happen within us as individuals, the individual work that's necessary to be done. And I put in the link in the chat, a link to The Mission of Somatics by Richard Heckler, in which he says that we're out of touch with our environment and the need for connection with one another because people are out of touch with their bodies. This is inner work. That's what I think, that's what interests me about this conference, not who the leaders are, but I really just, I wanted to put the observation about the leaders because our strategy is going to be very different if we're aiming at leaders than if we're aiming at followers, you might call them, but they're the people, assuming that democracy works. Social movements move from the bottom up, not the top down.
Thank you, Jerry. So I'm about to put you in breakouts according to people.
Oh, it's kind of, okay, I got you. All of them. Okay, cool. All right, so get ready.
So we're all back. And by the way, I see a couple of old friends I haven't seen in a long time, including Judy Kay and Jesse De La Rosa. And I also see Barbara Simmons, the local connection here. And not to speak of the fabulous Tabia Lee. Lately, I've gone over to the other side and it's in visit Fox News, being interviewed for Fox News and all that. In any event, welcome back, everybody. And so we had 3 different breakout rooms, and I'm curious if you can give some brief summaries as to what you discussed in your breakout rooms. So, Sharif, since you got back, you had all this time to prepare. Why don't you start?
Of course. We had a worldly whirlwind of activity, of questions of scope. The 3 things that I brought back. How do you get power not just to the people, but back to the people? How do you help people to recognize their own power? And I in my work, I spent a lot of time doing that. that inclusivity includes and is and has to deal with connection. To say I am inclusive, but then at the same time to say I'm not connected to anybody or I'm not connected to other beings, this is saying really that you're not really practicing inclusivity. In my own practice, there are a number of people that I am connected with who consider themselves active conservatives. If you frame the issue the right way, you don't automatically set up the divide between my group and your group. And I don't want to do that. If you want to be effective in the world, you don't want to do that. Then the last point is the importance of doing both your outer work and your inner work. The first level of inclusivity that I talk about is inclusivity with yourself. And look at the number of people in the world who are not inclusive with themselves, okay? Who are deeply disconnected within themselves, with themselves. And then that works in the world against them. But then while you're doing that inner work, you also have to do your outer work. And it's that the mixture of the inner work and the outer work that you have to deal with. And that's what we covered.
Thank you, Shariff. How about you, Kat, or somebody in Kat's group?
Does somebody in my group want to share? I'm happy to pass it on. Somebody wants to. All right.
Well, this is Ruth Ann. I took a lot of notes. I don't know if you noticed, but I really appreciated the concept, which aligns with what was just shared about personal and collective liberation. That our personal liberation is incorporated in our collective liberation, and using the stories of Exodus, infusing stories with empathetic prophecy becomes stepping stones to, and I didn't get to finish that quote, but there was a real beauty for me in recognizing that as we present narratives that are not problem-focused narratives, we create stepping stones to envisioning the world we want. So I'm going to stop talking now and let Kat finish because I really want to hear more.
Thank you. So
Thank
what
you.
I was saying is that, and as I talked about this, we talked about we delved a bit more into the two worldviews. And one of the things I pointed out was that the movement from this worldview of domination to a worldview of love is paved with stepping stones of prophetic empathy. And so, and I've seen this happen where, as I've engaged in prophetic empathy conversations with folks, we can move from fear and domination to love and dreaming and hope and vision. But I don't want to fool myself that because they have this one interaction with me, therefore now they're in the worldview of love. No, because they're going to go back out into the world and be infused with this worldview of domination. So the more people we have in the world who, in whatever way that they do this, can help people move from fear and domination to love and kindness, the more we will shift social consciousness and social energy toward a worldview of love. And that's part of what this prophetic empathy process is. And then somebody else asked the question, well, what do you do about, there was these questions about, well, what about those others who are doing bad things? I'm not going to specify, but are steeped in a bad worldview, let's say, or the negative worldview or the worldview of domination. How do we stand in our power? How do we stand in our truth and address that? And that to me is part of why I infuse empathy with prophetic consciousness. Empathy on its own can alleviate pain and suffering, but it doesn't challenge systems and structures of oppression. And so the prophetic consciousness is what allows us to challenge and question systems and structures of oppression, but to do it in a container of empathic discourse, of care and kindness, of listening, of seeing the dignity of each other. Nobody has ever changed consciousness through the process of being attacked and put down and shamed and blamed. That's just not, if you think about your own life, the ways in which you've been, the times that you have been willing to look at your missteps, the times that you've been willing to look at the owies that you've caused other people or yourself, probably weren't because you were told you were awful. They probably were because someone came and talked to you in a kind way with curiosity, or you were in a container that allowed for that level of self-connection and self-reflection. So that was another component. And a third component was, well, what do we do about the fact that people are being taught to hate the other and act in hateful ways? And what I pointed out was that there's a lot of incentives that, rather than blaming individuals, we need to look at the systems and structures in which we are raised and in which we raise our children, and to often flip those discourses and stories on their head and explore it. What if we talked about it this way? And then it can open our consciousness to see a bigger picture. So I'll stop there.
How about Lucas or somebody in Lucas's group?
I took some notes. I wasn't sure that we were reporting back, so I think I missed the beginning a little bit, but Neil told us about a place in Stanford, Forgiveness for Good, which sounds really fascinating. We were saying that we have things that we can identify with, even if they're on the other side. Number one is that all of us were probably traumatized. We came up with ways to recognize healing and collaboration. So the acknowledgement of the trauma, storytelling, which somebody just mentioned, what shaped each of us, and each side can do that. Radical forgiveness, seeing each other not as the other, but what are our shared values and goals, and then collective creativity.
Yeah, thank you, Ellie. And I think I'd just add to that, conflict transformation is about, it echoes some of, things that we just heard from Shariff and from Kat, just the opportunity to, and the ability to hopefully, in the midst of conflict, find ways to get curious about each other as a way to recognize the opportunity, recognize that the conflict represents something important is happening, and that we, it's really an opportunity for curiosity if we can find the strength within ourselves to move past what we're feeling, but to get curious.
Ellie, thank you for that overview. I want to punctuate, though, specifically Dr. Fred Luskin of Stanford University wrote a project called Forgiveness for Good, which it's radical forgiveness with the basic premise, rather than waiting for the other person to acknowledge wrongness, how do I liberate myself to be realigned with my core values? He tested this out in the 1980s in Northern Ireland, where in epidemic proportions, people experienced loved ones were murdered by the Civil War. And as a result of his work, many of the people involved concluded the best way to deal with my personal tragedy is to become part of the peace movement as a tribute to my loved one, so that nobody else has to go through this kind of personal hell.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Can I jump in for a moment here, Angela?
Yeah, sure.
I want to echo what Shariff and Lucas were saying, but most recently what Lucas was speaking about in this need for self-reflection and forgiveness. And I also, at the same time, want to hold the fact that I know that people sometimes experience that as as almost traumatizing for themselves. So I want to hold that. What I like to say to people is, if we have lots of people who are trained in the capacity for prophetic empathy, conflict transformation, all of these skills, nonviolent conversations, all of these things that we're talking about, then when you are reaching your limit, when you need to take a step back and engage in self-care, self-compassion, self-love, you can trust that somebody else can step in. So I don't want us to believe that I have to forgive when I'm not in a grounded, self-loving place for that forgiveness. I don't want to pretzel myself, I always like to say, or make myself so pained to forgive. I might just need to go get some empathy. I might need to be loved and held and cry and scream and vent and find my way through it in order to find that place for forgiveness. And I also want to say, and I wrote an article about this actually, that individual forgiveness is different than societal forgiveness. There is a difference. Somebody could individually forgive someone for engaging in an act that results in violence against someone else. But when that action is stemming out of systemic systems and structures of oppression, then there's other things that need to occur beyond just this individual forgiveness. People need to be held accountable. Systems need to be held accountable. And a whole other engagement process needs to happen in addition to one-on-one individual forgiveness.
And if I can follow up on that, and I'd also like to follow up on what, and the pictures just all moved around. Neil, I think, said regarding what had happened in Northern Ireland. I think that you can start walking a path toward forgiveness without saying, to someone who just oppressed you, I forgive you. I worked with some folks, some Northern Ireland activists on both sides, and realizing that this part of my emergence from dealing with solely African American issues, like other people in the world have issues too, and their issues for them are as powerful as your issues for you. And I'm noticing the hour, so I've got 25 examples, and I'll be glad to start out the workshop that I'm doing at the end of the week on those examples. Incentive for you to sign up.
Yeah, I wanted to spotlight that. We can stay a couple more minutes if people have, want to ask questions or whatever. And of course, I can also send them to the actual panelists if you have people things. But there's two upcoming things coming. Pat's thing, I think we called it something like revolutionary. I forget what we called it. Prophetic something.
We'll call it prophetic empathy and revolutionary love.
Thank you, Kat. I forgot. I'm sorry.
Oh, that's what we actually called it. That's what we'll call it.
Yeah. And Shariff has something next Saturday, I believe. And I'm going to put in the chat the sign up link that you can do that. And if it's like if you don't want to pay the suggested donation, there's an option to pay what you like, because we would like you to participate, because I think they would both be great activities. So with that, are there any other questions or that you would like to? And I know we're keeping people a little bit over, but this is your time.
Cool. If no one else has a question, just real quick, Kat, can you define prophetic empathy? I'm interested in
20 words or less. So the way I like to think about defining prophetic empathy is this integration of the prophetic consciousness, which includes in it a radical vision of a transformative world, putting forth the vision of the world we want, putting forth, as Martin Luther King said, the dream, rather than what we often hear, the complaint. So putting forth the highest vision of the world we want, not starting with, we'll settle for X, we'll settle for a little crumb here. Putting forth the highest vision, reminding people that we all want to live in this high visioned world, and then engaging in helping people see that through an empathic container. So it's an infusion of using what the prophets did in many ways beautifully, and also, as I said before, they were deeply problematic, patriarchal, many problems, but they also engaged in giving us a vision of this incredible world that has been motivating and inspiring for people for thousands of years, and holding it in a container of empathy and compassion that remind us that everyone is worthy of dignity and respect, that all of us are created in the image of a divine source, that's the language I use. You can substitute your own language for that, but I hope that captures it.
I love that. Thank you so much. How you feeling, Angelo?
I'm saying if it's just time for you, Shariff, if you're still there, you can give a little 20-second plug for the 12 steps of inclusivity or something. I forget what it's called.
Yes, the workshop coming up on Saturday is actually we're going to, what we just went through in 25 minutes, we're going to do in 3 hours of really looking at what does this concept of inclusivity, which I see as different from and deeper than inclusion. Let's get these people in on the deal here, but really start looking at it from the point of view of our spiritual, our emotional, our mental perspectives on how do we exist on this planet at this point in time, and how can we exist in a common framework with each other. It'll be very fast paced, but it'll also involve a lot of questions and a lot of group discussions. And I look forward to seeing you.
And I just put a description of mine in the chat for folks.
Well, I could have done that.
Yeah, I just put a link, and you can see.
If you had done that, then I wouldn't have been able to do while you were doing it.
Yeah, I just put a link that has both the descriptions in there if you want to go there. I guess I don't want to keep you from where you have to be on this Sunday afternoon or Sunday morning, wherever you are. But anyway, thank you very much for coming. It's nice to see you all. And Ian, did you want to give a little shout out for the network or whatever?
Yeah, I'll be really quick. I'll try to make it less than a minute. First, thank everybody for being here. This is really amazing. Like, every one of these really rejuvenates me and just makes me feel wonderful that people actually care. So thank you for coming. And this is the Sacred Inclusion Network. We're just a network of community of spiritually minded people who come together to have deep, vulnerable, intellectual conversations like this. There's a few ways you can engage, which is we have these monthly explorations. Usually it's only one panelist. This time we did it 3, and it can be a myriad of different topics, and they're always interactive. So it's not just one person talking the whole time. There's always some sort of give and take or some exercise. We have offer mastermind groups, which are usually groups of 8 to 6 people who meet bi-weekly to discuss whatever the group consciousness kind of wants to go. Usually deep things that people have difficulty talking about, maybe death or war or whatever the case may be. We're working on our first online workshop, which is all about helping our participants kind of find their dream/purpose and then take steps towards actualizing it. And lastly, we have an online platform. It's kind of like a mini social network for our most active members. And we just kind of continue these discussions. We ask each other questions. We send articles and videos and all types of things. So if you'd like to join or be a part in any way, Angelo's going to send you a follow-up email. Look out for that. And we hope to see everyone in the group, in the events. And yeah, thank you so much for coming. And thank you so much for our Lucas, Kat, and Shariff. You guys are wonderful, magical people. And we look forward to hearing more from you in the future. So have a blessed day. Peace.